March 1943, Baltimore, Maryland, Oakdale Street, building number 47. Detective Virgil Horace Thatcher stood in the doorway of the boarding house room on the second floor and stared at the table covered with other people's belongings. A silver spoon with the initials __quote _0 _ engraved in elegant script. A porcelain figurine of a ballerina, her arms raised in fourth position, paint chipped at the base. A man's pocket watch inscribed, "Faithful Service, Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, 1912." A woman's cameo brooch from before the Great War, the profile worn smooth by decades of touch. A child's wind-up toy, a tin drummer boy with faded red paint on his jacket. 143 items total, from 12 rooms, from one building, over 6 years. And the owner of all this, 35-year-old high school English teacher Merritt Cunningham, sat in a chair by the window, perfectly calm, hands folded in his lap as if they were discussing a library catalog rather than theft. He even smiled, a slight upturn at the corners of his mouth. "I simply wanted to understand how they lived," he said quietly, his voice carrying the measured tone of a man explaining a perfectly reasonable scientific experiment. Virgil felt cold crawl up his spine, vertebra by vertebra. This wasn't theft. This was something else. Something far worse. Something that made the skin on the back of his neck prickle with a primitive warning his rational mind couldn't yet name. It all started when Constance Theodora Whitfield, resident of room 8 on the second floor, discovered her silver spoon missing. This happened on February 10, 1943, the birthday of her grandfather, whom she'd never met but always remembered with the fierce loyalty of someone who understands that memory is the only immortality ordinary people achieve. Every 10th of every month, without fail, Constance Theodora opened an old mahogany box with brass corners and removed the only memento of Walter Hamilton, a silver spoon with the initials __quote _3 _ engraved in the ornate style of 1884, the year of his wedding. Grandfather died in 1874, 2 years before her birth, but her father always said, his voice going soft with remembering, __quote _4 _. The spoon was a bridge between generations, a tangible connection to a man whose blood ran in her veins, but whose voice she would never hear. Now, the bridge was gone. Constance Theodora was 67 years old in the winter of 1943. She'd lived through the Great War, the influenza pandemic of 1918, the Depression. And now this second terrible war, with its ration books and blackout curtains and telegrams that began, "We regret to inform you." She'd developed a particular memory for details, the memory of someone accustomed to counting every breadcrumb, every button on a coat, every match in a box. She knew precisely that she'd placed the spoon in the mahogany box on January 10th, after touching it to her lips the way she always did, feeling the cool metal against her skin, imagining her grandfather's hand holding it across the gulf of 69 years. Hadn't removed it since, hadn't moved it. The box sat on the dresser between the water pitcher and the photograph of her late husband Edmund, locked with a small brass latch that required a key. The key to the latch Constance Theodora kept on a chain around her neck, always, even while sleeping, even while bathing, feeling its small weight against her sternum like a second heartbeat. On February 10th, she opened the box, expecting the familiar gleam of silver, the weight of history in her palm. The spoon was gone. In its place, emptiness. The red velvet lining showed a rectangular impression where the spoon had rested for decades, the fabric slightly lighter there, protected from sunlight. But no spoon. First thought, the one that comes automatically to a 67-year-old woman living alone. Moved it and forgot. Age, memory failing, the slow betrayal of a mind that used to hold entire conversations verbatim, and now sometimes forgot why she'd walked into a room. Constance Theodora searched systematically, turned over every drawer, every shelf, every corner of her 12 by 10 room. Searched for 3 days, Each day the panic building like water behind a dam. The spoon was nowhere. Not in the dresser, not in the wardrobe, not under the bed, not in her sewing basket, not wrapped in her winter scarves, not tucked into a book, not anywhere. Then came the second thought, terrible and clear. Someone took it. Someone entered her room, opened her locked box, and took the only thing connecting her to a past that felt more real than the present. Someone stole not silver, but memory itself. But how? The door to her room had a lock, and she kept it locked whenever she left. The window faced the alley, second floor, too high to reach from the ground without a ladder, and she would have heard that. The box had been latched, and the key was around her neck. Unless someone had entered while she slept? The thought made her stomach turn. Someone standing over her sleeping form, lifting the chain, removing the key, opening the box? No. She was a light sleeper. The war had made her that way. She woke at the smallest sound, a door closing 3 rooms away, footsteps in the hallway, the creak of the building settling. Constance Theodora examined the latch carefully, holding the box near the window where February light came thin and gray through the glass. Scratches. Fresh ones, bright metal showing through the tarnished brass. Someone had opened it. Not with her key. With something else. A pick. Or a hairpin. Or thin wire. She knew about these things. Her brother had been a locksmith before the Depression, before he drank himself to death. She remembered him showing her how easy it was to open a simple latch like this. 30 seconds, he'd said, quote, _7 __. Constance Theodora didn't raise an alarm, didn't run to neighbors with accusations. She'd lived long enough to know that accusations without proof destroy the accuser, not the accused. She simply began to observe, with the patience of someone who'd spent years watching for signs of sickness, signs of financial trouble, signs of danger. And soon she noticed. Small objects in her room changed position. The book, quote, 8 she'd definitely left on the second shelf, spine facing out, was now on the third shelf, spine in. The tin box of buttons had shifted 2 inches left on the dresser, leaving a dust outline. A handkerchief she'd folded in a triangle, the way her mother taught her, now lay folded in a square, the way department stores displayed them. A pencil that had been sharpened to a stub was now sharp, as if someone had used her pencil sharpener and replaced it. All of this could be blamed on an old person's forgetfulness, on the tricks a tired mind plays. But Constance Theodora remembered exactly. She had systems. She placed things precisely. Some of these items she hadn't touched in weeks. On March 12th, she noticed the crucial detail, the one that confirmed she wasn't losing her mind. The photograph of her late husband Edmund Garrett, which always stood on the dresser with its left edge against the wall at approximately 30 degrees. She knew because she'd placed it there deliberately to avoid the afternoon sun's glare on the glass. Was now turned to 45 degrees. Difference, 15 degrees. The angle of light had changed. Dust had settled differently. The mark from the frame on the dresser didn't match its current position. Someone had picked up the photograph, lifted it, looked at Edmund's serious face, his hand-me-down suit, his expression of concentrated dignity from their wedding day in 1896. Placed it back. But not exactly. Close enough to fool a casual glance. Not close enough to fool someone who studied the angle of light on her husband's face every morning while she dressed. Constance Theodora sat in the chair by the window and thought. Someone enters her room. Regularly. In her absence. This person has a key or the skill to open locks. This person is careful, methodical, almost respectful. Nothing broken, nothing obviously disturbed. This person takes small things and sometimes returns them altered. This person studies her belongings, studies her life. Who? In the boarding house at 47 Oakdale Street lived 6 families and several single residents, 15 people total sharing 4 bathrooms and 1 kitchen. Constance Theodora occupied one room, 12 by 10 feet with one window facing the alley, a view of brick walls and fire escapes, a slice of sky. The other residents were ordinary people, the kind you'd pass on the street without noticing. The Harlow family, Preston Zachary, 42 years old in 1943, foreman at Bethlehem Steel's shipyard down at Sparrows Point. His wife, Adelaide Dorothy, 38, bookkeeper at a textile mill on Eastern Avenue. 2 children, daughter Phyllis, 12 years old, and son Wallace, 9. The Harlows occupied 2 rooms on the second floor and always smelled faintly of fried onions and laundry soap. Preston had hands scarred from hot metal, a drinker's broken capillaries on his nose, and a voice that carried through walls when he argued with Adelaide about money, which was often. Single nurse Winifred Lucille Drummond, 32, worked at Johns Hopkins Hospital on the surgical ward, night shifts mostly, came home at dawn smelling of ether and exhaustion. She was thin, colorless, with pale hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her face. She wore her nurse's cape even when off duty, as if the uniform was the only identity she possessed. She lived in one small room on the 3rd floor and was so quiet you'd forget she existed. An elderly couple, the Osgood family, Silas Perry, 71, retired railroad worker pension since 1936 after his legs gave out, and his wife Harriet Althea, 66, homemaker who'd never worked outside the house in 50 years of marriage. They occupied one room on the 1st floor, the one with the bathroom closest, because Silas couldn't manage stairs anymore. You could hear him coughing at night, deep, wet coughs that shook the walls, the sound of lungs filling with fluid. Newlyweds Calvin Roscoe Brandt, 26, machinist at the Glen Martin aircraft plant out in Middle River, making bomber parts, and Loretta Imogene, 22, cashier at the A&P grocery on Charles Street. They'd married in December 1942, 3 months ago, and still acted like honeymooners. Giggles through walls, furniture scraping, headboard rhythmically tapping. They had one room on the 3rd floor and dreamed of saving enough for their own apartment, though with wartime wages and rationing, that dream seemed distant as the moon. And Merritt Cunningham, 35 years old, English teacher at Western High School, taught sophomore literature and senior composition. He lived in one room on the 2nd floor, directly across the hall from Constance Theodora, a room lined floor to ceiling with books. Merritt read constantly, Hawthorne, Melville, Whitman, Thoreau, Emerson, underlining passages, making notes in margins, treating books like living conversations. He spoke in complete sentences, used words like underscore underscore quote underscore 9 underscore underscore and underscore underscore quote underscore 10 underscore underscore in casual conversation, quoted poetry while washing dishes in the shared kitchen. Merritt Aldous enjoyed special respect in the building. He was unfailingly polite, the kind of politeness that seemed bred in the bone rather than learned. He always greeted people first, always with their proper titles, quote 11, quote 12, and always held the door, waiting patiently even if you were half a hallway away. He helped elderly ladies carry heavy shopping bags up the stairs without being asked, appearing at just the right moment as if summoned by telepathy. When the Harlows' sink faucet broke, spraying water across their kitchen, Merritt Aldous appeared with tools and fixed it himself in 20 minutes. Didn't wait for the building superintendent who'd have taken 3 days and charged a fee. When Constance Theodora once forgot her keys inside the room, left them on the table while taking out trash, he volunteered to go down to the superintendent's office in the basement for a spare key. Returned an hour later, handed over the key with a slight bow, refused thanks. Underscore underscore quote underscore 13 underscore underscore underscore. He was cultured, refined, always with a book under his arm or in his jacket pocket. On Sundays, he attended services at the Episcopal Church on St. Paul Street, returning with the bulletin folded neatly in his Bible. He didn't smoke, didn't drink, didn't curse, didn't raise his voice. When children played too loudly in the hallway, he never yelled at them. Instead, he'd emerge from his room, kneel to their level, and say quietly, "Now, friends, I'm trying to grade papers. Could you perhaps take your wonderful energy outside?" And they would, charmed by his gentle request, the way he called them friends. The Harlow children adored him. He told them stories, not from books, but from his own imagination. Tales of knights and dragons adapted to fit wartime Baltimore, where the dragon was a German U-boat and the knight was a welder at the shipyard. He performed coin tricks, making quarters disappear behind ears, reappear from pockets. He helped Phyllis with her book reports, explaining the themes in Treasure Island with patience that made her feel smart rather than stupid. He let Wallace borrow his magnifying glass for a week to examine insects, didn't even flinch when the boy returned it smudged with fingerprints. That's precisely why Constance Theodora didn't suspect him. Couldn't suspect him. Suspecting Merritt Cunningham of theft was like suspecting the minister of arson. It violated the natural order. He was good. Everyone knew it. Everyone said it. That Mr. Cunningham, such a gentleman. We're lucky to have him in the building. If only more young people had his manners. But someone was entering her room, someone with a key. And keys don't materialize from air. Constance Theodora remembered that day 2 years ago when she forgot her keys. It was summer, July 1941, before Pearl Harbor, before everything changed. She'd been carrying bags of potatoes, too heavy for an old woman, but the price was right, and she'd walked all the way to Lexington Market to save a few cents. Merritt Aldous held the door, took one of the bags from her arms without asking, just lifted it gently, smiling. Quote, 20. She'd searched for her keys, coat pocket first, though she wasn't wearing a coat in July, just habit. Then her purse, digging through the accumulated debris of a woman's daily life. Handkerchief, compact, coin purse, ration book, peppermints. 3 minutes of searching. 3 minutes while Merritt stood there patiently, holding her bag of potatoes, not complaining, not checking his watch, just waiting. Then she remembered with a sick lurch in her stomach. Keys were inside, on the table where she'd set them while putting on her hat. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 21, underscore, underscore, she'd said. I'm so sorry. I've locked myself out. Merritt's response was immediate. Quote, underscore, 23, quote. He'd set down the potatoes, disappeared down the stairs. She waited in the hallway, feeling foolish, feeling old. He returned an hour later with the key on a labeled ring. Room 8. Handed it over with that same slight bow. She thanked him. He demurred, disappeared into his own room. Now, 2 years later, Constance Theodora thought about those 3 minutes. 3 minutes standing at her door with her keys on the other side. And understanding came like cold water down her spine. He could have made an impression. Pressed modeling clay or wax or even soft soap against the key's teeth while she searched her purse. The movement would have taken seconds. She wouldn't have noticed. She was distracted, embarrassed, focused on finding keys she knew weren't there. 3 minutes was enough, more than enough. Then take the impression to a locksmith, or make the key himself if he knew how. Hardware stores sold blank keys. Files were cheap. There were books explaining how. But Merritt Aldous wasn't a burglar. He was a teacher, an educated man, a gentleman who quoted Emerson and helped old ladies and made children laugh. He couldn't be. Could he? On March 20th, Constance Theodora decided to test her suspicion with the methodical approach of someone who'd spent a lifetime solving practical problems. She took a thin white thread, the same kind she used for mending stockings, the cheap cotton that broke if you pulled hard but held if you left it alone, and secured it between her door and the jamb at exactly 4 inches from the floor, low enough that someone entering wouldn't notice unless they specifically looked. She used a tiny piece of transparent tape, the kind that didn't leave residue. Inconspicuous. If the door opened, the thread would stretch, the tape would release, and the thread would fall. Simple physics. Constance Theodora left for the bakery on Oakdale Street. 20 minutes there and back. She timed it with her watch. Bought a loaf of rye bread, exchanged pleasantries with Mrs. Kowalski behind the counter about the weather and the war, returned to the boarding house, climbed the stairs, reached her door. The thread lay on the hallway floor, a small white line against the dark wood. Someone had entered. In 20 minutes, in broad daylight, she repeated the experiment the next day, and the next, and the next. Out of 5 times over 5 days, the thread fell 4 times. The pattern was clear. Someone entered regularly, consistently, at the same time of day. Between 11 in the morning and noon, the dead hour when most residents were at work, children at school, the building quiet as a tomb. Constance Theodora began listening with the focused attention of a surveillance operative. In a boarding house, you hear everything if you train yourself to listen. Creaking floorboards, each plank has its own voice, high or low, long or short. Footsteps, heavy or light, fast or slow, the rhythm revealing mood and purpose. Coughing. Conversations through walls, words muffled but tones clear. Arguments. Laughter. The scrape of furniture. Water running in pipes. Toilets flushing. Doors closing, each with its distinct sound depending on weight and hinge condition. Every resident has their acoustic signature, their personal symphony of daily sounds. The Harlows left for work at 8 in the morning, Preston's heavy footsteps descending the stairs, Adelaide's lighter ones following, their voices discussing the day's obligations. Returned at 6 in the evening, same pattern in reverse. The children left for school at 8:30, running feet, voices shrill with youth, the front door slamming despite repeated warnings. Home by 3, same chaos. Winifred Lucille worked rotating shifts at the hospital. 3 12-hour shifts, then 2 days off, the schedule irregular and unpredictable. When she was home during the day, Constance could hear her pacing in the room above, walking back and forth, as if unable to rest. The Osgoods rarely left their room except for meals in the bathroom. Old age had made them essentially homebound, every trip down the hallway a major expedition requiring planning and rest stops. The newlyweds were gone during the day, both at work, returning around 6:30 with grocery bags and youth's boundless energy. Merritt Aldous left for school at 7:30 in the morning, his footsteps measured and precise, leather shoes with metal taps on the heels, click, click, click down the stairs. Returned around 4 in the afternoon, same distinctive rhythm. But sometimes he stayed home. Teacher planning days, faculty meetings in the afternoon leaving mornings free, occasional sick days, though he was rarely ill. Constance Theodora made a chart with the precision of a scientist documenting an experiment. Drew a grid on lined paper, dates down the left side, times across the top. Marked with an X the days when the thread fell. In a second column, noted whether Merritt Aldous was home that morning. She could tell by listening for his footsteps leaving, or by their absence. Cross-referenced the data. The pattern emerged like a photograph developing in chemical solution. When Merritt was home during the late morning, the thread fell. When he was at school, the thread remained intact. 4 matches out of 4 tests. The correlation was perfect, statistically significant, impossible to dismiss as coincidence. On March 30th, Constance Theodora couldn't bear it anymore. The knowledge sat in her chest like a stone. She dressed in her best clothes, the navy dress from before the Depression, still good, carefully mended at the seams. Put on her hat, her good coat, her church shoes. Took the streetcar downtown to the police station on Fayette Street, walked up the steps, asked for a detective. Detective Virgil Horace Thatcher was a young officer, 32 years old, from a farming family, honest and stubborn. Born in 1911 outside Cumberland, Maryland. Father, Horace Benjamin, dairy farmer. Mother, Mabel Francis. 5 children, Virgil II. He remembered the Depression, hunger, bank failures, watching his father lose the farm in 1932. His older brother Russell enlisted in 1941, right after Pearl Harbor. Letters came regularly until November 1942. Then the telegram in January 1943, __, quote _ 25 __. Mother cried for 2 months. then stopped, just went quiet. After high school, Virgil joined the Baltimore Police Department 19 years old, the year 1930, when jobs were scarce as snow in July. Not from romantic notions. He'd read too many dime novels as a kid, imagining himself as a heroic detective solving murders, but reality had cured him of romance. He joined because there were no other options. Farming? Saw what that had done to his father, broke him like a horse broken too hard. The military? This was peacetime 1930, and the Army paid terribly. Police work offered stability, a salary of $40 a month, a uniform, respect, or at least fear, which was close enough. In 1934, at 23, Virgil finished the police academy, 6 months of training in criminal law, firearms, first aid, hand-to-hand combat, and became a beat officer walking the streets of East Baltimore. Made detective in 1940 after solving a warehouse burglary that everyone else had written off as unsolvable. He'd traced the stolen goods through 3 fences and recovered 80%, an unusual success rate that impressed the captain. Married in 1937 to a seamstress named Edna Pearl Mosier, quiet, modest girl from a Methodist family, dark hair always pulled back in a bun, small hands that could stitch perfect seams blindfolded. They'd met at a church social, danced twice, married 4 months later. No children. Edna had 2 miscarriages in 1938 and 1939. The second one nearly killed her from hemorrhaging. Doctors said, incompetent cervix, in those cold, clinical terms that made human tragedy sound like mechanical failure. After that, they stopped trying. Lived together in a small apartment on Greenmount Avenue, 2 rooms and a shared bathroom down the hall, Edna sewing piecework for a dress manufacturer, Virgil walking his beat or working cases. Detective work was routine 99% of the time. Saturday night bar fights between dock workers and shipyard workers and factory workers, all drunk on cheap beer, all swinging fists over imagined insults. Petty theft, shoplifting, pickpocketing, burglary of homes and stores, domestic disputes, husbands hitting wives, wives hitting back, children caught in the middle. The same addresses over and over until someone ended up in the hospital or the morgue. Draft dodgers, young men who'd failed to register or failed to report, tracked down and handed over to federal marshals. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that made him question the fundamental nature of human beings. Until March 30th, 1943, when Constance Theodora Whitfield walked into the station and asked to speak with a detective about a theft. She was precise in her presentation, with the clarity of someone who'd rehearsed what to say. Showed him her chart, the grid of dates and times, the X marks, the correlation with Merritt Cunningham's schedule. Explained the thread test in detail, the type of thread, the height of placement, the number of repetitions, the results. Described the scratches on the latch, the moved objects, book, button box, handkerchief, pencil, with exact measurements and observations about dust patterns. Showed him the photograph, explained the angle change, brought a protractor to demonstrate the 15-degree difference. Virgil listened carefully, taking notes in his detective's notebook, the small, leather-bound book he carried everywhere. This wasn't a hysterical old woman seeing phantoms or imagining conspiracies. This was a methodical person presenting empirical evidence with scientific rigor. Virgil asked. Constance said, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly in her lap. Virgil knew Merritt Cunningham slightly, had met him at a community meeting about the war bond drive back in January, where Merritt had spoken eloquently about civic duty and collective sacrifice, quoting Lincoln and Roosevelt, convincing half the room to commit to buying extra bonds. Cultured man, soft-spoken, the kind of person you'd trust to watch your children or handle your finances. Hard to imagine him as a thief. But Virgil had been a detective long enough to know that thieves came in every form. The most successful ones didn't look like thieves. Virgil said carefully. Constance said. Virgil studied the chart again. The pattern was undeniable. When Merritt Aldis was home during late morning, the thread fell. When he was at school, the thread remained intact. If this were a court case, This would be circumstantial evidence, but strong circumstantial evidence, Virgil said. Constance said quietly. Over the next 2 weeks, Virgil arranged discreet surveillance. On April 8th, he positioned himself in a vacant room across the alley. The owner had died in February. The room was being cleaned out before re-renting, with a pair of binoculars borrowed from the evidence locker. The window faced the boarding house's second-floor hallway through a window at the stairwell landing. Not a perfect angle, but serviceable. He arrived at 10:30 in the morning, settled into a chair, waited. Patience was 90% of detective work. The other 10% was luck. At 11:15, movement. Merritt Cunningham emerged from his room. Virgil recognized him from the community meeting, the same neat appearance, hair combed, wearing a cardigan sweater over a white shirt. Walked down the hallway with measured steps, stopped at Constance Theodora's door. Looked both ways, a quick professional glance to verify the hallway was empty. Reached into his cardigan pocket, removed something small. From this distance, Virgil couldn't see clearly, but it had the shape and size of a key. Inserted it into the lock. Turned. The door opened. Merritt entered, closing the door behind him with the careful quietness of someone who didn't want to announce his presence. Virgil checked his watch. 11:17 a.m. Started counting. At 11:29 a.m., the door opened. Merritt emerged, locked the door behind him, returned the key to his pocket, walked back to his own room with the same measured pace. 12 minutes inside. 12 minutes in someone else's private space without permission. Virgil felt his stomach tighten, the physical sensation of watching a crime in progress but being unable to stop it. Constance Theodora was right. The evidence of his own eyes confirmed it. But entering a room wasn't necessarily illegal by itself. Maybe Merritt had a legitimate reason. Maybe he was watering plants for her. Maybe she'd asked him to retrieve something and forgot. Unlikely, given what Constance had told him, but a defense attorney would raise these possibilities. Virgil needed more evidence, something concrete, something that would hold up in court. He needed to see what Merritt was doing inside that room, what he was taking, what he was hiding. On April 14th, Virgil obtained a search warrant from Judge Nathaniel Morrison, a narrow-faced man who'd seen every form of human depravity and no longer expressed surprise at anything. Virgil presented the evidence. Eyewitness testimony from Constance Whitfield about the theft of the spoon, the thread test results, his own surveillance confirming unauthorized entry. The judge read the affidavit, signed the warrant without comment, handed it back. Quote 40, quote, he said. Quote 41, quote. At 6 o'clock that evening, Virgil knocked on Merritt Cunningham's door. Brought 2 uniformed officers for witness purposes and safety. You never knew how people would react when confronted. Merritt answered after 3 knocks, surprised but maintaining his composure. He wore the same cardigan sweater, reading glasses perched on his nose, a book in his hand. Quote 42 by Thoreau. Bookmark about halfway through. Quote 43, Merritt said, his tone polite and questioning. Virgil held up the document, the official paper with the court seal. Merritt's expression didn't change. No panic, no flash of guilt, no anger, just calm intellectual curiosity, as if Virgil had announced an interesting but abstract proposition. Quote 48, he repeated. Quote 49. The search took 3 hours. Virgil and the 2 officers worked methodically through the room, which was larger than standard. Merritt had convinced the previous landlord to rent him 2 rooms and remove the connecting wall, creating one long space. Books lined every wall, floor to ceiling. Novels, poetry, philosophy, psychology, history, arranged by subject and author with library precision. A desk held papers, a typewriter, pens, a narrow bed in one corner, a wardrobe, and a closet, door closed. Virgil opened the closet and felt the world shift. 7 spiral notebooks stacked on a shelf. Hundreds of pages of handwritten text, dense and detailed. Virgil opened the top one, read random passages, felt cold comprehension spreading through his body like poison. These weren't school materials. These were research notes, psychological profiles. 12 residents of 47 Oakdale Street coded by letters. Subject A, Constance Whitfield. Subject B, Preston Harlow. And so on through the alphabet to Subject L. And beneath the notebooks, items. 143 items. Virgil counted them later at the station. Carefully arranged on shelves in the closet like museum displays, each with a small label, handwritten in the same neat script as the notebooks. Subject A, February 10th, 1943. Silver spoon, initials WH, probable family heirloom, Depression-era anxiety attachment. Subject D, November 3rd, 1941. Wedding photograph, Adelaide Harlow, emotional anchor for marital distress. Subject F, June 18th, 1940. Child's toy soldier, Wallace Harlow, compensation for absent father figure. Virgil picked up one of the notebooks at random, opened to a middle page. Read, Subject A, Constance Whitfield, female, 67 years, widow, exhibits classic signs of Depression-era anxiety manifesting as object attachment and ritual behavior. Hoarding tendencies, keeps every scrap of paper, every button, every string, organized in containers labeled by type and date. Her attachment to the silver spoon, taken February 10th as test stimulus, represents not material value, $3 to $4 melt value, but psychological continuity with pre-trauma identity. The spoon functions as transitional object in Winnicott's sense, mediating between past self, granddaughter of prosperous tradesman, and present self, elderly widow living in one room. Removal of this object should trigger defensive behaviors, increased vigilance, security measures, paranoia. Observation period, February 10th to March 1st. Results. Subject A began locking box more carefully, key worn on chain 24/7, checking position of objects daily, exhibiting signs of hypervigilance, listening at door, monitoring hallway activity. Hypothesis confirmed. Object removal successfully mapped onto anxiety cascade. Next test. Move photograph by 15 degrees. Predict she will notice within 3 days and interpret as evidence of intrusion. This will escalate anxiety to paranoia threshold. This wasn't a thief's diary. This was a research journal. Cold, clinical, analytical, written with the detachment of a scientist studying specimens, not a criminal hiding guilt. The language was academic, citing psychological theorists, using technical terminology, proposing hypotheses and documenting results. But the subject matter was monstrous. Human beings studied without consent, their private lives invaded and dissected, their emotional responses documented like lab rats running mazes. Virgil flipped through more pages, found entries on other subjects. Subject B, Preston Harlow, male, 42 years, foreman. Displays functional alcoholism masked by occupational success. Hidden flask in toolbox. Taken March 15th, 1941. Returned March 22nd. Contained rye whiskey, approximately 6 ounces, suggesting daily consumption pattern. Drinks after wife sleeps. Audible through walls. Footsteps to kitchen. 11:45 p.m. plus or minus 15 minutes. Return 12:05 a.m. Function. Emotional regulation. Suppression of rage related to economic emasculation. Wife earns more. Threatens male provider role. Test hypothesis. Temporary removal of flask should trigger compensation behavior. Increased bar visits, hidden bottles. Result. Subject purchased new flask, hid in different location, under mattress, discovered via systematic search April 2nd. Alcoholism confirmed as dependency, not habit. Subject F. Wallace Harlow, male, 9 years, student. Seeks male attention due to father's emotional absence. Father works 60-plus hours weekly, returns exhausted, has minimal child interaction. Boy demonstrates attention-seeking through minor mischief, loud play, boundary testing, and responds strongly to positive male attention. Borrowed his toy soldier, June 18, 1940, for 2 weeks. Boy exhibited distress, asked parents about it, searched room, cried. Returned toy to different location. Boy found it, interpreted as own forgetfulness. Emotional regulation still developing. Will monitor for long-term anxiety patterns. Subject G, Winifred Drummond, female, 32 years, nurse. Suffers from unrequited love manifesting as epistolary fantasy. Discovered letters, hidden in hatbox, read April to May 1942. Addressed to soldier, Corporal James Everett Dawson, 3rd Marine Division. Identified from envelope. Letters never sent. No postage, no mailbox deposit. Content: romantic fantasy, detailed imagined scenarios of life together after war, intimate confessions. Subject has never met Corporal Dawson. He is brother of her co-worker, seen once in photograph. Fantasy serves as emotional escape from loneliness of night shift work and social isolation. Profound sadness underlying all text. No intervention planned. Letters are harmless coping mechanism. Page after page. 12 people. 6 years of observations. Theft wasn't the point. Theft was methodology. Merritt was using stolen objects to trigger emotional responses he could document. He was running experiments on his neighbors, without consent, without ethics oversight, without any recognition that what he was doing constituted violation. Virgil said slowly, his voice tight with controlled anger. Merritt sat calmly in his chair, hands folded in his lap, looking like a professor about to deliver a lecture. Merritt corrected gently, as if the distinction mattered. Virgil felt anger rising like heat in his chest. Merritt said, his tone maddeningly calm. Virgil stared at him. This man showed no remorse, no shame, no recognition that he'd committed crimes against actual human beings. Only intellectual pride. The cold pride of someone convinced his quest for knowledge justified any method. Virgil had seen this before in other contexts. Criminals who'd convinced themselves their actions were justified. But never quite like this. Never someone this educated, this articulate, this convinced of his own righteousness. Virgil said. Merritt nodded, accepting this as if it were an expected research outcome. Quote 77. Quote 78, Virgil said. Quote 79. Quote, as the officers led Merritt out in handcuffs, he looked back at his book-lined room with something like wistfulness. Quote 80. Quote, he said. Quote 81. Quote, the trial began on June 7, 1943. The courthouse on Calvert Street, 2nd floor, Judge Morrison presiding. The prosecution, led by Assistant State's Attorney Harold Weinstein, presented overwhelming evidence. The 7 notebooks entered as Exhibits A through G, the 143 stolen items catalogued and photographed, testimony from 12 victims who described their sense of violation, their lost sense of safety, their realization that someone had walked through their lives invisibly for years. Constance Theodora Whitfield testified on the first day, wearing her navy dress, her voice steady. He took my grandfather's spoon. That spoon was all I had from a man I never met but who gave me his eyes, his stubborn mouth, his blood. Mr. Cunningham took it not for money, but to see how I'd react, to document my grief, to turn my emotional pain into data for his research. That's worse than theft. That's treating me like an experimental animal. Preston Harlow testified about discovering that Merritt knew his secret. I read in his notebook that he'd watched me drink, that he'd documented my shame, that he'd taken my flask and waited to see how I'd respond, like I was a rat in a maze. My marriage ended because my wife read those notes during the trial. She left me, took the children. I lost everything because this man decided to study me without asking. Winifred Drummond testified in a voice so quiet the judge asked her twice to speak up. He read my letters. The letters I wrote to a man I'd never met. Letters I'd never send. Letters that were private because they were fantasies, dreams, stupid dreams of a lonely woman. And he read them, analyzed them, wrote about my epistolary fantasy and profound sadness like I was a case study in a textbook. I burned those letters after I found out, burned them all. But I can't burn the knowledge that he read them, that someone saw my most private thoughts and judged them. The defense, led by attorney Marcus Pemberton, argued diminished capacity. Pemberton presented 3 psychiatrists who examined Merritt and testified that he suffered from a psychiatric condition, what they called pathological curiosity coupled with empathy deficit disorder, that compelled him to observe and document human behavior without normal social restraint. He wasn't a criminal, they argued. He was mentally ill. He needed treatment, not prison. The jury deliberated 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. 12 counts of burglary, 143 counts of theft, 12 counts of trespassing. Judge Morrison sentenced him to 8 years in Maryland Penitentiary, the maximum allowed under state law for property crimes. Quote 86, quote, the judge said, quote 87, quote. Merritt listened to the sentence without visible reaction, as if hearing about someone else's fate. But the story didn't end with the sentence. In prison, Merritt Cunningham became a model inmate. Taught English classes to other prisoners, men with third-grade educations who'd never read a complete book. Started a reading program, convinced the warden to purchase a library of classic literature. Wrote essays about rehabilitation and the power of education, published in prison reform journals. The warden, a progressive man named Arthur Caldwell, praised Merritt as a man who made a terrible mistake, but genuinely desires reformation through intellectual growth. After 3 years, Merritt was transferred to a minimum security facility in Western Maryland, a former farm converted to house nonviolent offenders. After 5 years, granted parole for exemplary behavior, released in September 1948. By then, the war was over. VJ Day had come in August 1945. Soldiers had returned. The economy was booming. The world had changed utterly. Merritt found work as a clerk in a used bookstore on Reed Street, a dusty place that smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco. The owner, an elderly man who didn't read newspapers, never learned about Merritt's past. Merritt lived alone in a small efficiency apartment on North Avenue, kept to himself, read constantly, never spoke to neighbors beyond basic greetings. But the residents of the Oakdale Street boarding house never forgot. Even after most moved away, scattered by time and change, they remembered. They remembered the man who studied them like insects under glass, the man who turned their private lives into research data, the man who smiled while violating their trust. Constance Theodora Whitfield never felt safe again. She moved to a different building in 1944, but still checked her locks obsessively, installed a chain lock, a deadbolt, a security latch, positioned furniture against the door at night. Still felt watched. She died in 1951 at age 75, and her niece who cleaned out her room found 17 locks purchased but never installed, a pile of unused security devices representing 8 years of sustained fear. Winifred Drummond, the nurse, never recovered from learning that Merritt had read her letters, those private fantasies written to a soldier who died at Normandy in June 1944, a man named James Everett Dawson, who never knew she existed. She burned the letters in her kitchen sink the day after the trial, watching paper curl and blacken, crying while the smoke rose. Never wrote again. Never spoke of love again. Never trusted her own private thoughts, convinced that private meant visible to those who knew how to look. Preston Harlow's life unraveled completely. His wife Adelaide left him in 1945 after reading the trial transcripts, after seeing in print that he drank every night, that he felt emasculated by her higher salary, that Merritt had documented his shame. She took the children to Pennsylvania, remarried in 1947. Preston drank more. Lost his job at the shipyard in 1949 after showing up drunk 3 shifts in a row. Worked odd jobs. Drank more. Died of cirrhosis in 1952, 46 years old, in a charity ward at City Hospital. alone. The damage wasn't in the stolen objects. The damage was in the violated trust, in knowing that someone had walked through their lives invisibly for 6 years, had touched their belongings, read their secrets, judged them, written about them, without permission, without consent, without conscience, had reduced them from full human beings to research subjects, from people to data. Merritt Cunningham lived until November 1989, died at age 81 in a nursing home in Towson, Maryland. Heart failure, the doctor said. No family present. He'd never married, had no children, no siblings, his parents long dead. No friends attended the funeral. The obituary in the Baltimore Sun ran 3 lines. ___, quote, _ 89 ___. No mention of his past. No mention of the trial. Just 3 lines marking the end of a life that had damaged so many others. But something happened in his final years that the nursing home staff found disturbing. Merritt became paranoid. Claimed people were entering his room at night, moving his things, watching him. The director, a sympathetic woman named Patricia Morales, assured him this wasn't happening. The facility had security, locked doors. Staff did rounds. No one was entering his room. But Merritt insisted. Someone comes, he said. I feel it. Things are moved. My books, my glasses. Someone is observing me. The director, trying to calm him, installed a camera in his room with his consent, thinking the footage would prove nothing was happening. And she was right. The footage showed nothing. No intrusions, no visitors. Just an old man sitting in a chair staring at the door, convinced someone was coming. Every night the same pattern. Merritt sitting alert until midnight, then dozing fitfully, waking at every small sound, checking his belongings, finding them exactly where he'd left them but still convinced they'd been disturbed. The director attributed it to dementia, Alzheimer's, the slow dissolution of mind that comes with age. But one young orderly, a college student named Marcus Washington studying psychology at Morgan State, read Merritt's file after hearing about the paranoia. The file included records from his 1943 arrest. Maryland kept prison records for 50 years. Marcus learned about the case, read the brief summary, understood what Merritt had done, and wondered, was this karma? The observer becoming the observed? The invader feeling invaded? Or was it guilt, finally surfacing after 46 years, manifesting as the fear that someone was doing to him what he'd done to others? Merritt died believing he was being watched. The irony was noted by exactly one person, Marcus, who wrote about it in a term paper for his abnormal psychology class. The professor gave it a B+ and wrote in the margin, ___, quote, _92 __, ****, epilogue. March 2002, 59 years later. Baltimore, Maryland. Archives of the Maryland State Police, housed in a concrete building on Reisterstown Road. A researcher of American social history, Professor Dalton Frederick Quincy, 61 years old, born in 1941, studies cases from the 1940s for his book about privacy and surveillance in wartime America. He's been working for 3 years on a manuscript about how rationing, blackouts, home front paranoia, and communal living arrangements affected concepts of domestic privacy. The working title is The Watched Home: Privacy Under Pressure in World War II America. He's in the archives reading criminal case files from 1943, looking for examples of privacy violations, burglaries, domestic disputes that might reveal attitudes about private space. He stumbles upon case number 347, filed April 24, 1943. State of Maryland versus Merritt Cunningham. Reads the initial summary. Stops. Reads it again. This isn't just burglary. This is something extraordinary. A man who studied his neighbors through their possessions. A man who walked through others' lives invisibly for 6 years. A man who kept scientific records about neighbors without their knowledge or consent. a man who treated human beings as research subjects in an experiment they never agreed to participate in. Dalton requests the full file. It takes 3 days to retrieve from deep storage. When it arrives, he spends an entire day reading. Trial transcripts, victim testimony, psychiatric evaluations, the notebooks themselves. 6 of them survived in the archive. The 7th returned to victims and lost to time. He can't look away. This case is everything his book needs. A concrete example of how privacy boundaries were crossed, how surveillance functioned in domestic spaces, how one person's quest for knowledge became another person's nightmare. But it's more than that. It's a disturbing mirror of contemporary America in 2002, where security cameras multiply on every street corner, where the Patriot Act allows unprecedented government surveillance, where people voluntarily document their lives on social media, creating permanent records of private moments. Dalton requests additional materials, learns that the archive preserved one complete notebook, not returned to victims, accidentally filed as evidence, forgotten. Notebook number 3, covering observations from January to December 1938. Merritt's second year in the boarding house. The archivist, a thin woman named Dorothy Chen, brings it to him, wearing white cotton gloves, handling it like a sacred text. Quote 94, quote, she says. Quote 95, quote. Dalton opens the notebook carefully. The binding is fragile, the pages yellowed but intact. 120 pages of graph paper, the kind used in science labs, with neat handwriting and blue fountain pen. Entries organized by date and subject letter. He reads, quote 96, quote 97. Page after page of observations written with clinical detachment but deep invasiveness. Dalton understands. This is a unique historical document. Evidence of how one person perceived others in the 1940s. Evidence of how the concept of privacy was understood, or violated, in shared living spaces. Evidence of how someone with intelligence and education could commit profound ethical violations while maintaining belief in the righteousness of his scientific pursuit. This matters for understanding the era, for understanding boundaries of privacy in American society during wartime, for understanding how fragile the line between observation and invasion, for understanding how knowledge could be pursued without wisdom, without ethics, without recognition of human dignity. Dalton writes an article, titles it, quote, 98, quote. The article appears in the Journal of Social History in June 2002, 16 pages including footnotes and excerpts from the preserved notebook. It generates discussion at academic conferences. Some critics say, this romanticizes crime, turns a thief into a researcher, gives intellectual credibility to a man who violated vulnerable people. Others say, this is important documentation showing how privacy boundaries were negotiated during wartime, how people existed under constant visibility in shared housing, how surveillance functioned in domestic space. Dalton expands the article into a book, spends the next year tracking down surviving victims or their descendants. Through Social Security records, death certificates, pension databases, old city directories, he locates several. He finds Winifred Lucille Drummond. She's 91 years old now, born in 1911, living in a retirement community in Annapolis, a brick building near the Severn River. She rarely leaves her room, arthritis, weak heart, old age making every movement an effort. But when Dalton calls and explains his purpose, she agrees to meet. He visits on a Tuesday afternoon in October 2002. She's sitting in a wheelchair by a window, looking out at trees turning autumn colors. Small woman, thin as paper, hair pure white, hands gnarled by arthritis. But her eyes are sharp, her mind clear. She listens while Dalton explains the book, a scholarly examination of privacy and surveillance in 1940s America, using the Cunningham case as a central example. Winifred says, not a question, a statement. Winifred says, Winifred turns from the window, meets his eyes. ___, quote _104___. Dalton records her words on a cassette recorder, transcribes them that evening, includes them verbatim in the book's introduction. They become the most quoted passage when reviewers discuss the book, the sentence that captures the essential horror. Evil that wears the mask of refinement is invisible until too late. The book publishes in October 2003, titled Invisible Invasions, Merritt Cunningham and the Boundaries of Privacy in Wartime America. Published by Johns Hopkins University Press, print run 5,000 copies. It sells surprisingly well for an academic work, 7,000 copies in the first year, driven by reviews in the Washington Post and Baltimore Sun that frame it as relevant to contemporary debates about post-9/11 surveillance and security versus liberty. People read the book and ask themselves uncomfortable questions. How many Merritt Cunninghams live among us today? In an era of security cameras, internet search histories, social media profiles, data mining, email monitoring, GPS tracking, facial recognition, biometric databases, how many polite neighbors, cultured colleagues, refined acquaintances actually study our lives? Watch through digital windows, read our posts, analyze our photos, track our movements, record our habits, map our social networks, all while smiling, all while being helpful, all while convincing us they